So I mentioned, at least briefly, a few days back when, maybe a week ago, when there's a bill pending in Congress, and that's got some highfalutin long name that is ostensibly about international economic competition, by which they mean competition with China. And it's a bill that would basically just give a whole bunch of taxpayer money to big tech companies, at least one of the main things it would do, like giving Intel billions of dollars. And, as a libertarian, I always object to plans like that, really for two reasons. One is it's not a proper role of government, and two is these plans never accomplish what they say they're gonna accomplish. So on a practical basis, I'm against it, and on a philosophical basis, I'm against it. But I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on the government funding of science, but I know someone who is. And that someone is Terence Kealey. He's a professor of clinical biochemistry at the University of Buckingham in the UK, from where he joins us this morning. Terence, thanks so much. It's great to have you back on the show. It's been too long.
It's lovely. Can you hear me all right?
I hear you fantastically well, including that excellent British accent.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was born with it.
That's an interesting way to put it. Before we talk about government funding of science, I want to ask you two other things related to your work. You are at the University of Buckingham, which I note is the only private university in the UK. That's remarkable. How is it that every university in the UK except yours is a government institution?
Okay, well, I'm actually now an emeritus professor. Actually, to be technically correct and to be a bit pedantic, all British universities are actually private, unlike in the States, where many universities are owned by the states. But you also have independent universities. So technically, all British universities are actually private organizations. Okay. None are owned by the government. But what they've all done, apart from Buckingham, is sign very restrictive contracts with the government, by which the government takes huge control in exchange for giving them money. They've all sold out, basically, apart from Buckingham.
Is Buckingham like the Hillsdale of England?
It's a perfect analogy, Hillsdale or Grove City College, but without the religion. I don't know how much religion matters in Hillsdale and Grove City College. I think quite a lot. Buckingham is purely a philosophical exercise in libertarianism.
Wow, fantastic. And then my other question for you, and I'm sure based on your definition of University of Buckingham, it won't apply there, but in most of the rest of the English university system, is it as mired in political correctness and wokeness and economic idiocy and other such things as our universities are here?
Not as much, but undoubtedly moving the same way. It is one of the awful things about Britain, is we're always 5 or 10 years behind the United States, but it's always the same trajectory. So I'm afraid the universities are moving that way. What is very, very interesting is there are two universities that don't have trustees, the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. And there, the academics are actually the governing body, which is actually legal throughout the entire Western world. There's nothing to stop any university following that if they wanted. And at Cambridge in particular, the academics are fighting back against wokeness. Twice they forced the university president to back down on some woke things, which is, so for example, the university president at Cambridge wanted the university to respect all ideas as equal, Black Lives Matter or whatever, and the academics pushed back and said, no, we will be courteous to other ideas, but we will not treat all ideas as equal. And this is what happens actually when a democracy can overrule the rule of trustees, which I think is interesting.
Very interesting. And I'm glad to hear that story. I think there's not too much pushback against wokeness within academia here. I think at lower levels of education, by which I mean younger people, not lesser quality, but high school kinds of education, I think we're starting to get pushback by parents, but not yet within the institutions themselves. Anyway, that's quite fascinating. You wrote a piece for Cato in their economic policy brief about a week ago entitled "Don't Be Like China: Why the United States Government Should Cut Its Science Budget." And one of the great things about reading your work is not only do you often say, like, why such and such a plan might not be a great idea, but you take it the next step. Not only do we not need to do that, we need to do the opposite of that, right? So tell us a little bit about this bill that's coming up that has inspired you to write this thing that you have, in fact, been thinking and talking about for quite some time.
The bill is a disaster, and it's the same in Britain. And it's bipartisan and Anglo-American. And the last time there was a bipartisan Anglo-American initiative that the rest of the world did not engage in was when we jointly invaded Iraq. That was bipartisan, that was Anglo-American, and we know how well that went. And this is going to go the same way. And for one very simple reason. It is simply a myth that the government funding of science stimulates economic growth. And the reason we know this is that the agencies of the American federal government itself have chronicled this time and time again. So it's the Defense Department who first pointed out that the government funding of pure science did not help America's defense capacity. It was the Congressional Budget Office that twice reported that huge government expenditure in the United States on science did not stimulate economic growth. It was the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, of which the United States is the most important member, that has reported that the government funding of science seems actually to damage economic growth. And recently, it was a scholar at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Study after study has come out of the federal government to show that every time the federal government increases its expenditure on science, it does not stimulate the economy and may actually push it back.
You know, it's funny, when you get into this conversation here, people fall into this trap. I often say on the show, the plural of anecdote is not data, right? But people very, very much fall into anecdotes when it comes to this conversation. Like, look at this thing that we got from, NASA's basic science research, or look at Al Gore inventing the internet, right? But they can come up with one or two things that came out of government research, and I suppose the point they're trying to make with those things is that somehow we wouldn't have those things if the government hadn't done that. But of course, we can't and shouldn't assume that kind of thing, right?
No, the Congressional Budget Office is amazingly good on this. The Congressional Budget Office has pointed out that when the government supports a program, a company, a university, good things come out. So at an individual basis, at an anecdotal basis, it's a good thing. What no one ever considers is what Bastiat would have considered, is what is the price you pay for that? And the price you pay for that is there are only so many good scientists. And if you take good scientists and put them into particular projects, you're depriving the rest of the economy of those good scientists. And so it's not a win-win. I'm afraid, it's a zero-sum game. And what we don't see is the things those scientists would have done in other parts of the economy. And we know that it has absolutely no impact collectively. Look, for example, at Moore's law. We've known that since 1890, that's a very long time ago, by the way, since 1890, every 2 years, the power of computing doubles. That's to say, the power of computing per dollar has doubled since 1890, since the days when computers are simple mechanical things. And yet that increase is completely unaffected by war or disease or socialism or communism or the federal funding. Nothing changes. It just carries on growing, doubling every 2 years. It is impossible, and this is an extraordinary fact, it is impossible to show any aggregate or collective analysis that shows that the government funding of science has stimulated economic growth in any country, let alone America. You can point only to anecdote. And that, of course, always forgets the thing that you've paid a price for by pulling the scientists out of something else.
You will be pleased to know that I guarantee you, there is no radio host in the United States of America who mentions Bastiat more often than I do.
Oh, good.
All right, so I'm going to play devil's advocate for a little bit here with you, okay? And for those of you just joining, my special guest from the UK, Terence Kealey, Professor Emeritus of Clinical Biochemistry at the University of Buckingham. And he's joining us by Zoom, so if you're watching us on Facebook right now, you can see him live and me live. All right, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute, Terence. But China, right? China they're taking on all the foreign currency from the trade deficits, and they're giving that money, the government is giving that money to basic science research. So how can the United States be expected to compete when our biggest competitor is sending billions and billions of dollars through the government to their own scientists?
Thank you for that question. Let me remind you that we've been here before. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. In the early 60s, which was the first space satellite, circling satellite. A few years later, they launched Yuri Gagarin, the first man into space. And everyone understood by then that the Soviet Union was about to overtake America, because the Soviet Union had shown and proved it understood science and technology much better than those stupid Americans who'd left it to the market. In fact, of course, the Soviet Union was wasting its money on stupid projects and actually in the end collapsed out of sheer poverty. China today, its GDP per capita is only a quarter or a sixth of America's, depending on which particular category you use to. It is a very poor country. It is true that in certain areas it has perfectly respectable technology. But the idea that China, which is only a quarter as rich as America, is any form of threat to America is a joke. But it's a very unfunny joke, because it's a joke that's being pushed by the military, the big companies looking for contracts, and other people looking for government subsidies, including the universities, for what they do. The threat from China is ridiculous and absurd, but it's very convenient for lobbyists who are trying to persuade the American government to give them money.
So this may be drifting slightly out of your lane here, but on the China threat piece, separate from science, I do think it's reasonable to say that they are somewhere between a significant competitor and an outright threat on a military basis in a certain part of the world, and they need technology to do that. Does that play into this conversation at all?
Well, you're absolutely right. And actually, it's a very fair point. There is a difference between a government, whether the Chinese or the American federal government, funding defense research for some geopolitical purpose, and funding research to compensate for so-called market failure, which is a myth. There is no market failure in science. However, there is a Chinese threat, and here I agree with you, and the other, because China, although very poor, is huge, and therefore the total amount of money it can spend on defense research is not trivial, and the amount of money it can spend on defense, period, is not trivial. Is China a geopolitical threat to the United States and to the world? Oh, yes, it is. No question. There can be no doubt that America, as the leader of the free world, should be armed against the army and the Navy and the Air Force in China. And if that requires defense research, then so be it. But that is completely different from this bill before Congress, which is all about stimulating the American economy, so-called, by funding science, so-called. That will all be wasted. However, if the Defense Department says we need A, B, or Z for this particular military reason, the absolute size of China means it's a legitimate threat and should be confronted. And as you say, that then starts to fall outside my lane.
Right. Okay, good. I'm glad we clarified that, and I think we're on the same page there. So tell us a little bit about the National Science Foundation. Why did it start? What does it claim that its purpose is, and how does it actually function?
The National Science Foundation, in many ways, I'm afraid, is a scam and has been shown to fail. So it originally was created by the scientists the federal government funded during the Second World War, who did not want to go back to peacetime activities, but who wanted to carry on being funded by the government because it was a very nice way of living. Thank you very much. However, the scientists of the Manhattan and other such projects, they were largely made redundant in 1945. And that was the end of that, except that the Cold War started again. The American government, until 1950, only funded research for defense reasons, for no other reason. So in 1947, actually, a bill was in fact passed through Congress, but Truman vetoed it because they wanted the National Science Foundation, Congress wanted the National Science Foundation to be what it is now, basically an organization that the federal government gives a large amount of money to so that scientists can do exactly what they want according to the terms they want to play. And Truman said, this is undemocratic. Federal money should be accountable to the federal government. So he vetoed the bill. But in 1950, when the Soviet threat was becoming real, the military threat was becoming real, he wanted more scientists, he wanted to train more scientists for the defense industries, and so he decided to go along with NSF. Chief executive reports to the president, a sort of hybrid between what he wanted and what the scientists wanted. But it essentially funded pure science for the purpose of training scientists and so-called correcting for market failure, which is a myth. And when Sputnik flew around, everyone recognized that the NSF model had failed, which is why they then created ARPA, later DARPA, which has a completely different model. That is a geopolitical model that says, we want a goal, whatever that goal might be, a better tank, and therefore we will employ science if necessary in the service of that goal, but we won't fund science for its own sake, because that's an absurd model. We'll only fund it in support of a geopolitical goal set by the politicians. And now the function of the NSF is actually quite cynical. It's to keep the universities at bay. The American government today now doesn't fund anything, any science for its own sake. All that huge funding that used to go to industry and agriculture is largely pulled back, with the exception of the NSF, because if the federal government cut back on the NSF, then scientists and academics on both sides of the aisle would swamp the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times with claims that the American economy will collapse. And so 5% of the American federal government's expenditure on science goes to the NSF. Everyone knows it'll achieve very little, but it'll keep the scientists off the government's back.
Wow. All right, let me ask you one last question, Terence. If I say you're now on the debating team, and you know that when you're on a debate team, you have to make the best argument for whatever you're told your side is, whether or not you personally are on that side. So if I told you, all right, Terence, you need to make the best argument you can find for government giving billions of dollars to Intel and AMD and NVIDIA and these large technology companies, you know, in the name of competing against China or something, what would the best argument be in favor of that?
Well, it could be the cynical Lyndon Johnson argument, by which we know that Lyndon Johnson used to give huge sums of money to certain Texas companies, federal contracts, and in return, these companies would give him personally 1% of that revenue, which he then took into his re-election campaign, and so the cycle continued. On a more serious note, the only justification for giving these monies to these huge companies, don't forget, some of them have research budgets already of between $10 or $20 billion a year anyway. But the only justification would be, give us a better tank, or a better submarine, or a better aeroplane than the Chinese have. And also, and this is relevant, this is genuinely relevant, we don't want any more offshoring. We don't want to be making any more silicon chips in China, because if war breaks out, we do not want our supply chains disrupted. So if you give these companies money so that they re-import their supply chains or come up with a better aircraft carrier, that is the only, and it's actually quite a good justification.
That's a fascinating point. Is it good enough if you were in Congress and these companies said to you, hey, Terence, if you give us this money, we will spend at least half of it, and let's say you knew to a metaphysical certainty that they would abide by this. We will spend at least half of it building high-tech manufacturing capacity in the United States that now we do overseas. Would that get close to getting your vote if you were a member of Congress?
I think yes. I mean, we've learned from the pandemic that these supply chains that are international can be very vulnerable. And I mean, I think we have to accept, look, China is one day going to invade Taiwan. Anyone who doesn't understand that doesn't understand geopolitics. China doesn't want to rule the world. It's actually quite restricted in its ambitions, but within its geopolitical ambitions, it is deadly serious. One day, China will take Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Where America stands on that will depend, of course, on the Congress of the day, but it may be that it'll come to a shooting war. I don't know. If that's even a possibility, the idea at the moment, don't forget, there's an enormous amount of manufacturing capacity for American computers actually in China, even as we speak. So the idea of repatriating that so that in the event of a crisis with China, they can't blackmail America, that seems to me a very good idea. But don't think that's going to stimulate economic growth. As such, it simply makes America geopolitically more secure.
Fascinating. Terence Kealey is a professor emeritus of clinical biochemistry at the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom, from where he joined us this morning at 1-something p.m. What did you call it? Summertime?
We call it British summertime, which is an hour different from Greenwich Mean Time.
Love it. Terence, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for making time with us for us today. I appreciate it.
It was great.
Thank you so much. All right, folks, I hope you found that as interesting as I did.